Hello, I'm Ollie. This is Criminally, where I talk about crime, pulp, horror, that kind of thing. Today, everything. It's my weekly wrap-up. So it's Saturday morning. I'm back to my normal routine after filming last week's wrap-up on the Friday, which means I've had an extra day of reading. So there's a few more books to go through this time, and I've also been off work this week. So I've actually got 13 books to talk about, which feels like quite a lot for a weekly wrap-up, doesn't it? And I think the reason for that high volume, aside from the extra day and the fact I've been off work, is I have been deliberately prioritising some shorter books. Because I am keen to get through my 100 book challenge. So I'm up to book 75 now. I just finished book 75 this morning. So yeah, the end is very much in sight. And I have actually, there are a couple of things on my TBR for this month. So Shoggy Bane and Return of the King. And what was the other one? Daisy Jones and the Six, which I was going to read, which I think I'm going to leave. I think I'm going to park those for now. Because I want to get through the 100 books as quickly as possible. My aim is, and I am still, I'm not reading like short stories and counting them as books. I'm reading, there have been a couple of novellas in there, but I am typically just reading shorter novels. My aim is, with it being March of the Mammoths in March, is that I get up to book 99, and then the Mammoth, which I'm going to read for March of the Mammoths, which is Lonesome Dove, will be my 100th book, and then after that I'm free of the shackles of the 100 book challenge. So it's been a busy week reading wise. I think I moaned a bit in my wrap up last week about having had a terrible week. So I'd had a bad day, at least. I'd had a bad day at work. We had work going on in the house. There was a storm, there was all sorts of stuff going on. Anyway, this week has been much better. So as I say, I've had the week off work and spent 3 days of it in a lovely, they call it a glamping pod, but like a purpose-built pod in the countryside on a farm, completely secluded from everyone. So this farm was huge. It's only about half an hour away from here. So I went there with my wife and son, and we had a smashing time. So right in the woods on this farm, with a lovely lake in front of us, well, big pond basically, but absolutely glorious. Just bird song all the time. You could just hear the noise of the road in the far distance, but basically our days were filled with bird song, beautiful views, lots of trees, lovely walks, no light pollution at all at night. So my son's really into astronomy, so we took our like stargazing binoculars with us and looked at the stars, and it was absolutely breathtaking. I have to say, the difference in the number of stars that we could see there compared to here in the town was just outstanding. So yeah, a very nice, relaxing time. There was a pheasant that used to come and greet us every morning and like knock on the window of the pod we were sleeping in. So yeah, it was absolutely fantastic, and I feel very much refreshed and ready to go back to work next week. So in terms of reading, so I've only read 2 physical books this week. The rest have been on my Kindle, because obviously I was away, so it's easier just to take the Kindle. So let me go through these. So these will be unsurprising for people. So Vegas Vendetta by Don Pendleton, which was, I've lost track of where we are. I think it's book 8 or 9 in the Executioner series, which was really good fun. So it had McDowell and the Executioner going to Vegas to take on the mafia there, and teaming up with this stand-up comedian. So there was some fantastic bits that were basically just the comedian's act, which were really quite entertaining, quite well written, quite an interesting take on kind of ethnicity and things like that in the States, particularly Italian Americans. So yeah, it was slightly different from the other books, different enough to be really enjoyable. I had some cracking action in it as well. Well, not then, I think I read this one first actually. So also read Raiders of Gore by John Norman, which is the 6th book in the Gore Chronicles. So this, I have to say, was kind of boring. It was all about, there was a lot more kind of politics and cultural stuff in there. There was some like pirate type stuff, so some bits set on boats and sea battles and things like that, which were quite entertaining. But it definitely wasn't as enjoyable as some of the previous Gore novels has been. Another bibliophile reads, Greg, has predicted that book 7 will be the turning point for me, and that the Gore novels get completely unpalatable after that point. So we shall see. I'll definitely be reading the next one in March. So yeah, we'll see how I get on. But yeah, this was a bit of a disappointment. Definitely didn't enjoy it as much as the other books in the series. Right, I'm going to have a sip of my coffee before it gets cold, and then pull out my iPad to get up the list of all the other books I read. I'll try and do these in order. Okay, so first up then, Broken Shells by Michael Patrick Hicks, which I did mention in my wrap-up last week. I said that was likely going to be my next book, and indeed it was. So this was a really good horror novella. I'm not sure how long it was, about 100 pages or something like that, I think. About a guy who gets suckered into a too good to be true kind of deal where he thinks he's going to get some free money effectively, and then finds out that there's something far more sinister going on. And it had a fantastically bewildering sequence where he'd gone to this place. It's a car dealership, because he's got this ticket that says he's won, basically. And I won't give too much away, but basically in a heartbeat it changes from being something very commonplace to something completely alien and weird. And it was really disorienting and creepy and scary and very effectively written. After that, the book becomes a bit more straightforward in terms of it being a kind of survival horror kind of thing. But I thoroughly enjoyed it. It's the second book I've read by Michael Patrick Hicks. I've got a couple more on my Kindle, I think, so I will definitely be reading more. It was very, very entertaining. Far less entertaining was my week 4 pick for February Fantasy Stories, the Urban Fantasy Week, which is when it all began, by Adele Abbott, which was just completely ridiculous. And I probably should have predicted that it would be. So this is about a young woman who and they never really say where it's set, but I think it's set in the UK, in that there's certainly lots of words and terminology used that seem to anchor it in the UK. So she's a private detective, having taken over her dead father's detective business, and she's adopted, and she then finds out, she gets a message saying that her birth mother wants to see her, and she's never met her birth mother, so she goes to see her birth mother, who's this old woman in a nursing home, who then dies. But before she dies, she tells this young woman, whose name escapes me, that she's a witch, and it turns out she's a witch and she does magic and stuff like that. But it was just so the mystery in it was terribly handled, which is kind of a multiple murder case, and it's never really clear why she's investigating it rather than the police. And then the use of magic in the book, so she very quickly learns to do magic, but it was just so clumsily handled. So for example, there's this spell she can do where she can read anyone's minds, which you think would be fantastic for a detective, but she can only do it like once a month or sort of something ridiculous like that. So yeah, the whole thing was just ludicrous. I didn't enjoy it at all. Yeah, I think I gave it 2 stars because I did finish it, but that was pretty generous, to be honest with you. I think I've got another two books from the series on my Kindle, but I do not intend to read them. Okay, next up was Nightwing by Martin Cruz Smith. So I think this was like a 3-star read for me. So it's a book about a small community in the States that's plagued by vampire bats. So not vampires, just bats. And it has some really interesting characters in it. I'm not sure, I can't remember when it was written, but like late 70s, early 80s, I think. So it had some really good characters. It's set partly around a Indigenous American reservation, and Cruz Smith himself is, I think, half Native American. So there was some really interesting stuff there about, the kind of culture and just the way of life and that kind of thing. And then there was another character who was quite interesting, who's this guy who was on a mission to destroy as many bats as he could, basically, because his father had been killed by one. So he's like travelling around America, finding people to hire him to kill bats, which was quite entertaining. But it just lacked in the horror department a bit. It was never horrifying enough to be really tense. So yeah, it fell a little bit flat for me. But Martin Cruz Smith, I think, is quite an interesting writer. So most famous for having created the character Arkadyrenko, who's a Russian detective. And there are, I don't know how many books there are in the Renko series, but at least 10, I think. And I've got most of them on my Kindle, I think, because there was a Kindle deal on them a while ago. But Gorky, I remember when Gorky Park came out, which is the one that I have read from that series, it seeming like a really big deal and part of kind of the opening up a bit of Russia. So I guess it was must have been pre-Gorbachev, but you know, to when it felt like communism was starting to fall apart a bit in Russia, and the Soviet Union was starting to collapse, and the influence of the West was growing. So yeah, a really interesting book, Gorky Park, and I'm going to reread it at some point and read the other books in the series. I think Martin Cruz Smith is a really good writer. I don't know if Nightwing was his first novel. I think it may have been, and I think maybe that's why it wasn't quite as good as it could have been. I know there's a movie as well, Claude Reed's, whose channel is definitely worth checking out. It does really interesting stuff on comic books and kind of older, like, vintage horror novels. He's a big fan of the movie, and I do need to check that out and watch that at some point. So yeah, that one fell a bit flat. Okay, so next up was a book that was a complete hoot. So another novella called The Secret World of the Sex Witches, which is credited to an author called Musidora, who's like a made-up character, but was actually written by Anne Billson, who I have talked about on the channel before. So Anne Billson is a British film critic, so has written extensively in publications like The Guardian and The Telegraph and for Empire magazine. So really good film critic, very into kind of horror cinema, and writes really interestingly about horror cinema, as well as kind of women in cinema and that kind of thing, but also a novelist, and she's written some really good horror novels. So this was kind of a spoof erotic novella about this young woman who gets possessed by a sex witch, which basically sends her completely insatiable, and it was just filled with absolutely ludicrous sexual acts. It was very funny, and not particularly erotic, I have to say, just completely ludicrous, but hugely entertaining. So yeah, I very much enjoyed that, and appropriately enough, if you've seen the short video I did for it, that was book 69 in my 100 book challenge. My son made a guest appearance in the YouTube short, which I think has got the most likes of any video I've ever done so far. So yeah, if you haven't watched that, I'll try and remember to link to it. That was quite entertaining. So next up, I read the second. Well, actually, I don't think it is the second Doc Savage novel. It's the second Doc Savage novel in the Bantam reprints, which was The Thousand-Headed Man, which was very entertaining. Also, it has to be said, hugely racist. So a very dubious portrayal of like Asian characters, basically, very definitely of its time, and quite unpalatable in terms of that portrayal of that particular ethnicity. But it was, as a pulp novel, it was very entertaining. Great kind of jungle adventuring, some really good fight scenes. His Doc Savage's team have these, I can't remember what they call them, like mega machine pistols or something like that, which can fire all sorts of different types of ammunition, a bit like Judge Dredd's Lawgiver pistol, or is it Lawmaster? I can never remember which is the gun and which is the bike. But yeah, a very entertaining pulp novel for all of its faults. Next up was The Levee, the second of the novels in the Blackwater series by Michael McDowell, which was fantastic. So I'm really loving these books, and I think the next book I read is going to be book 3. So yeah, very entertaining, kind of Southern Gothic. I'm pretty sure I'll do a full review video of the whole series when I've finished it. But I'm loving these books. They're massively entertaining. I guess the thing that makes them so great is the characters, because there's, in each of the 2 books so far, there's been a little bit of horror. But mostly it's just about the characters and the relationships between them, and they're just so well written and so entertaining. I'm really enjoying the series. So next up was The Man from London by Georges Simenon. So this is one of his few non-Maigret novels. So I've only read one of the Maigret novels, and indeed that's the only other book by him I've read. but I've got a good fair few of them on my Kindle, so I will be working through those at some point. So this was originally published in 1933. This is a new translation, so Penguin are publishing like new translations of a lot of his work. I don't know if they're going to do all of it or not, because obviously he wrote absolutely tons. But yeah, it was a very entertaining, not really a mystery, I would definitely call it a crime novel, about a guy who works as a signalman on the railways at a port in France, who spots an altercation between these two mysterious characters who got off the boat, which involves one of them being murdered, and this mysterious suitcase getting dropped into the sea, and the signalman manages to get the suitcase and finds that it's full of money, and it's about what happens thereafter. So it's a classic sort of crime and punishment type book in terms of it, you know, being about the guilt he feels about not having reported the murder and all this sort of stuff. So yeah, very entertaining. Only a short novel. I think it was about 150 pages, but I really enjoyed it. It was definitely really gripping stuff. You really wanted to find out what happened to this character. Next up, another novel in translation, so Fair Play by Tove Jansson. So if you don't know Tove Jansson, she was the Finnish-born creator of the Moomins, if you know the Moomins. So this was a completely not the sort of book I normally read, so an incredibly gentle book that was just about the friendship between two women. And if that sounds boring, then it wasn't at all. There was something almost magical about it, in that it was incredibly readable, incredibly, as I say, gentle, very sweet, very moving. Just a heartwarming book that was very lovely to read. I can't, you know, there's no real story to it. It's just, a lot of it is just conversations between these two women. But yeah, a very enjoyable read, and yeah, beautifully written. After that, I fell into something of a kind of non-fiction political, I don't know what you call it, black hole, maybe not a black hole, rabbit hole. So my son is getting really into politics and had been talking a lot recently about anarchism, and I remembered that I had Noam Chomsky's book on anarchism on my Kindle, so I thought I'd give that a read, and it was really good. So there's 5 different sections to it, and it's a bit of a mixed bag, in that certainly one of the sections, which was about the Spanish Civil War, and an anarchist kind of commune that existed during that, was quite heavy going and felt very kind of academic. But some of the other sections were much more digestible and were really just kind of interviews with Chomsky about his views on socialism and anarchism. So I found it a very illuminating and interesting book. And I certainly, you know, whilst I definitely don't consider myself to be an anarchist, I can certainly see why it is in many ways an appealing philosophy. And you know, quite different from what most people think it is, I think. So as I say, that led me down a bit of a rabbit hole. So as I said, one of the sections was about the Spanish Civil War, and mentioned George Orwell's book Homage to Catalonia, about his time fighting in the Spanish Civil War, and I remembered that I also had that on my Kindle, so I read that next. So that was fantastic. You know, clearly a very well-known and well-respected book, and rightly so. So a very even-handed and fascinating description of, you know, what it was like to be a fighter in that war, and you know, fascinating in terms of there being so little war in it, really. You know, a lot of it was just kind of slogging around and putting up with terrible conditions rather than actually fighting. But a very interesting analysis of the politics behind the war and things like that as well. So there's a couple of, I don't know how it was originally published, but in the version I read, you get the main story, which very much focuses just on Orwell's experiences. And then at the end, there were 2 chapters which were presented as appendices, which are kind of his analysis of the different political groups that were, you know, apparent in Spain at the time. And you know, the circumstances that had led up to the war. So yeah, really interesting, and clearly it's a very important, you know, the Spanish Civil War plays a very important part in the kind of history of the 20th century in Europe, and you know, particularly in its lead up to the Second World War. So that was very interesting, and again, really fantastically written, and you know, a very personal account of war. But you know, very, very interesting and thoroughly recommended if you haven't read it. After that, so the last book I've read this week, which I've just finished, was We Need to Talk About Putin by Mark Galeotti, which is again quite short, so I think about 150 pages, but a really interesting analysis of Vladimir Putin, published I think in either 2018 or 2019, so somewhat out of date now, but felt like an appropriate time to read it given events over the last week or so. So yeah, so Galeotti is a journalist, a Western journalist, I think British, who has spent a lot of time, you know, reporting on Russia and living in Russia. So yeah, a very clear and simply laid out analysis of the different aspects of Putin's character, and what makes him seem so unpredictable and challenging to Western politicians. So yeah, it was very, very interesting. I'm not sure, I don't know enough about Putin or about modern Russia to assess how accurate a portrayal of Putin it really is, but it certainly gave me a lot of food for thought, and was very interesting to reflect on some of his theories in light of the invasion of Ukraine that's happened recently. And really a lot of his analysis of Putin boiled down to the fact that Westerners tend to see Putin as being some kind of mastermind and having a grand plan for everything he does, but really Putin's much more of an opportunist and looks to exploit any situation for his own gain, which I think, you know, makes sense in terms of what's happened recently. So yeah, that was a very interesting book. So that's everything I've read this week. Quite a busy week reading wise, and I suspect next week when I'm back at work will be less busy. As I say, I think I'm going to read one of the Blackwater books next, and may indeed just read through the next 4 in order. Though I kind of like the idea of reading at least one book in between each instalment, given that they were, you know, it was originally published as a serial novel. I think it kind of makes sense to do it that way. So yeah, in terms of channel stuff, so had my mystery video which went up in the last week, and I've subsequently published the video explaining the mystery as well. So congratulations again to Catherine, who was the first person to successfully solve the mystery. If you haven't watched that yet, you can still watch the mystery video and try and solve it yourself. But yeah, hopefully people found that entertaining. I certainly enjoyed doing it. I've also had, I had my young adult and kids book library tour go up in the last week, and a review of the Japanese novel Confessions, as well as, which tag did I do? I did the numbers tag this week, which was a video that I completely botched the uploading of. So it kind of was up for a couple of hours and then disappeared, and it's now up again. So if you haven't seen that, look out for that. In the coming week, I've got a video going up tomorrow, Sunday, which is just me talking about what I love about paper books. Obviously I'm a big advocate of the Kindle and a big Kindle reader, but I do think there's something magical about paper books as well. So I talk about that a bit in this video. I've got a tag video going up on Tuesday, which I think was going to be the Oh You Like Jane Austen tag. I've got another library tour on Wednesday, which from memory I think is another crime one. And then on Thursday I've got a review video going up of I think 6 stories by Matt Weslowski. So look out for that. And then I will also be at some point in the week putting up both my March TBR and my February wrap-up videos. And then obviously next Saturday we'll have another weekly wrap-up. So yeah, that's what the week ahead looks like. Nothing much else to talk about today, so hope everyone out there is safe and well, and look forward to speaking to you again soon. Cheerio.